Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Caribbean forts.
Caribbean forts.
Yeah, we got a fascinating collection of articles and website excerpts all about these historical
Oh,
fortresses.
cool.
Yeah, and they're from all over the Caribbean, spanning from St. Kitts and Nevis to Puerto Rico, Grenada, Dominica,
Oh,
and even reaching the Caribbean side of Panama.
that's a wide range.
Yeah, it is a wide range.
Wow.
So get ready to uncover some seriously cool history.
Okay.
We're talking about a fort nicknamed the Gibraltar of the West Indies,
Uh-huh.
secret tunnels designed for explosive defenses, and even a fort built facing inland instead of the sea.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it's incredible how these structures are more than just crumbling stone. They're like puzzle pieces scattered across the Caribbean, each holding a piece of the story of colonization, conflict, and the lives of the people who lived and fought within their walls.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
We often think of the Caribbean as a paradise of beaches and sunshine, but its history is far more complex.
Right.
European powers were constantly vying for control of these islands, and these forts were their strongholds, their
Yeah.
symbols of power.
Yeah.
To really grasp this, let's visualize the Caribbean during this era.
Okay.
Imagine a network of trade routes bustling with ships carrying gold, silver, spices,
Uh-huh.
treasures that made these islands incredibly valuable.
I see.
But this wealth also attracted rival nations and, of course, pirates.
Yeah, that's where these forts come in.
Yeah.
They weren't just about defense. They were about control. Controlling key trade routes, protecting valuable ports, and projecting power in this fiercely contested region.
Right. And building these forts in the Caribbean was no easy feat.
Yeah.
Imagine the logistical challenges, hauling heavy materials often quarried locally,
Yeah.
dealing with the tropical climate and finding skilled labor, often through forced or enslaved labor.
Right.
A dark side of this history we can't ignore.
No, we can't.
It's mind-boggling when you think about the sheer scale of these constructions.
It is.
And you're right, the human cost is something we need to acknowledge as we explore these forts.
Yeah.
It adds another layer of complexity to their stories.
Definitely.
But for now, let's zoom in on one of these impressive structures.
Okay.
Brimstone Hill Fortress in St. Kitts.
Brimstone Hill Fortress.
Yeah, they don't call it the Gibraltar of the West Indies for nothing.
It's a big one.
It is a big one. Imagine this. You're standing on a volcanic hill, 800 feet high, and before you is this colossal fortress built by the British over an entire century from the 1690s to the 1790s.
Wow, that's a long time.
It is a long time.
Yeah.
Can you picture the thick walls of black volcanic rock, the cannons strategically positioned, and the soldiers patrolling the battlements?
I can.
You can.
What's fascinating about Brimstone Hill is that it wasn't just about brute strength. The location itself was a strategic masterpiece. From that vantage point, you could see for miles, monitoring sea traffic and potentially spotting enemies long before they reached the shores.
Oh, wow.
So no wonder it was considered virtually impregnable.
But was it truly impregnable? History tells a different story, doesn't it?
Ah, yes, the French. Despite its formidable defenses, Brimstone Hill fell to the French in 1782. This wasn't just a military defeat. It was a symbolic blow to British power in the region. It reminds us that no fort, however strong, is truly unconquerable, and that the Caribbean was a constant battleground for control.
That's a great point. It wasn't just about building forts, it was about holding on to them.
Yeah.
And that meant navigating a web of alliances, betrayals, and constantly shifting power dynamics.
And those shifts in power are reflected in the very architecture of these forts. For example, Brimstone Hill, although primarily a British construction, shows evidence of earlier French fortifications, indicating a layered history of conquest and adaptation. You can literally see the history of conflict etched into the stones.
Oh, that's so cool. It's like each layer of brick and mortar tells a story.
Mm-hmm.
So what were some of the key features of Brimstone Hill that made it such a formidable fortress?
Well, you have the classic elements of a well-defended fort ammunition stores for storing gunpowder and shot, artillery officer quarters for the commanders, and strategically placed bastions like the Prince of Wales Bastion, which offered a wider field of fire.
Wait, what's a bastion exactly? I'm a sucker for those architectural details.
A bastion is a projecting part of a fortification built at an angle to allow defensive fire in several directions. Imagine it as a kind of bulwark jutting out from the main wall, giving defenders a tactical advantage.
Ah, that makes sense. So they could essentially cover more ground and create a crossfire if enemies got too close.
Precisely. And then, of course, you have the Citadel, the highest and most heavily fortified part of Brimstone Hill, known as Fort George. This was the last line of defense, the heart of the fortress.
It's amazing to think about the level of planning and effort that went into these constructions, but what I find really captivating is the human element. The lives of the soldiers stationed at these forts, the conditions they endured, and the constant threat they faced.
Right.
It must have been a challenging and at times terrifying existence.
Absolutely. Imagine the isolation, the sweltering heat, the ever-present threat of disease, and the constant tension of knowing that an enemy attack could come at any moment.
Speaking of attacks and defenses, let's shift gears and journey to another iconic fort,
Okay.
Fort San Cristobal in Puerto Rico.
Fort San Cristobal.
This one, built by the Spanish, takes a different approach to defense, focusing on protection from land-based threats.
Interesting.
But what really intrigues me are the secret tunnels.
The tunnels.
Yeah, they sound like something out of an adventure novel.
Tunnel.
What can you tell us about them?
Those tunnels were a stroke of military genius. They weren't just escape routes. They were a complex network designed to move troops and supplies undetected, allowing the Spanish to defend the fort from within. And you're right, some historians believe they were also designed for a rather daring defensive tactic involving black powder explosions
Black powder.
to disrupt enemy advances.
Wow, that's intense. Imagine being an enemy soldier thinking you're about to breach the walls, and suddenly, boom, the ground erupts beneath you. I'm not surprised they never actually used that strategy.
Right.
It sounds pretty chaotic,
It does.
but it speaks to the level of ingenuity and determination
Yeah.
the Spanish had in fortifying this key location.
Remember, Fort San Cristobal was constructed over 150 years, starting in 1634.
Wow.
That's a testament to the long-term strategic importance of Puerto Rico for the Spanish.
Yeah.
They poured resources and expertise into making this fort a symbol of their power in the Caribbean.
So it wasn't just a fort, it was a statement. It makes you wonder what it must have been like to be stationed there.
Yeah.
A soldier, an engineer, maybe even a family living within those walls.
Right.
Did those tunnels ever serve a more mundane purpose,
Possibly.
like storage or shelter during storms?
Why, possibly.
Hmm.
We have to remember that these forts weren't just military installations. They were communities. Soldiers lived there. Families sometimes accompanied them. And there would have been a whole support system in place to keep the fort functioning. The tunnels, beyond their military use, might have served various practical purposes.
That's fascinating. It adds another dimension to our understanding of these forts. Okay, so we've explored the strategic brilliance of Brimstone Hill and delved into the secrets of Fort San Cristobal. Now I'm ready for another adventure. What other Caribbean forts have stories waiting to be unearthed?
Well, let's hop over to Curacao, where we find Fort Amsterdam,
Fort Amsterdam.
guarding the entrance to Santa Ana Bay. This fort, built in 1635, played a vital role in protecting Curaçao's harbor, which was a major hub for trade and, unfortunately, also for the transatlantic slave trade.
Right. That's a sobering reminder that while these forts represent incredible engineering feats and strategic prowess, they were also deeply entangled in the darker aspects of history, like the slave trade.
Right.
It's important to acknowledge that as we admire their grandeur.
Absolutely. Fort Amsterdam stands as a silent witness to that complex history. And speaking of witnesses, there's a tangible piece of history embedded in its very walls.
Really?
A cannonball fired by Captain Bligh's troops during a skirmish. Yes, that Captain Bligh of Mutiny on the Bounty fame.
No way. That's amazing how a single artifact can connect us to a much larger historical narrative. It makes you want to reach out and touch that cannonball, feel that direct link to the past.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about dates and names in a textbook.
Yeah.
It's about real events,
No.
real people, and their impact on the world. And sometimes those echoes of the past are literally etched into stone.
Okay, I'm adding Fort Amsterdam to my must-visit list.
Good choice.
But before we move on, you mentioned that Curaçao's harbor was a hub for the slave trade.
Yeah.
Did Fort Amsterdam play a direct role in that horrific system?
Well, while it wasn't built specifically for that purpose, its strategic location meant it indirectly facilitated the flow of enslaved Africans through Curaçao.
Right.
The fort protected the harbor, ensuring the safe passage of ships involved in this inhumane trade.
It's a stark reminder that even the most impressive structures can be intertwined with dark chapters of history. It makes you appreciate the importance of understanding the full context, the good and the bad, when we explore these historical sites.
Precisely. Now let's shift our focus to Aruba, where we find Fort Zoutman.
Fort Zoutman.
Claiming the title of Aruba's oldest building, constructed in 1798, it was named after Dutch Rear Admiral Johan Arnold Zoutman, a naval hero known for his tactical skills.
So this fort is named after a real-life swashbuckler.
A swashbuckler.
What was he famous for?
Zoutman's most notable victory was during the Battle of Doggerbank in 1781, where he skillfully outmaneuvered a British convoy protecting Dutch merchant ships.
Oh, wow.
He was a symbol of Dutch naval power, and naming the fort after him was a way of bolstering Aruba's defenses and projecting strength.
I bet those walls have seen their fair share of action. But unlike some of the other forts we've discussed, Fort Zoutman seems to have had a more peaceful later life, right?
Indeed, today Fort Zoutman has been beautifully restored and houses the Historical Museum of Aruba. It's a fantastic example of how these historical structures can be repurposed, serving as cultural centers and repositories of history.
That's wonderful. It's like they've transformed from symbols of war and defense into guardians of history and culture. And what about that tower I see in pictures? It looks like something out of a fairy tale.
Ah, you're talking about the Willem III Tower added to the fort in 1868. It served several purposes over the years.
Mm.
First, housing Aruba's first public clock, then acting as a lighthouse, its beacon guiding ships safely through the night. Today, it adds to the fort's charm and offers stunning panoramic views of the island.
Okay, I'm definitely picturing myself climbing that tower and imagining what it must have been like to see those ships approaching their sails, billowing in the wind. So we've had the Gibraltar of the West Indies, secret tunnels, a cannonball from Captain Bligh, and now a fort named after a naval hero and topped with a fairy tale tower. What other Caribbean fort adventures await?
Well, let's set sail for Tobago, an island that has changed hands between European powers a remarkable 32 times. Each shift in control left its mark, and you can see this layered history reflected in Tobago's numerous forts.
Wow, 32 times. It's no wonder Tobago is dotted with forts. It must have been exhausting, constantly switching allegiances and rebuilding defenses. Which of Tobago's forts stand out in this historical tug of war?
Two forts in particular capture the essence of Tobago's turbulent past, Fort James and Fort King George.
Okay, tell me more. What makes them so special?
Fort James, overlooking Great Cortland Bay, is one of the oldest colonial forts on the island. Its origins date back to the 1650s, making it a tangible link to the early days of European colonization in Tobago.
Dominica is known for its lush rainforests and stunning natural beauty, but I'm betting it has a fascinating fort history, too. What can you tell us about Dominica's fortifications?
Dominica's most significant historical site is Fort Shirley, nestled within the breathtaking Cabrits National Park. Now, what sets Fort Shirley apart isn't just its stunning location, but its connection to a powerful story of resistance and the fight for freedom.
Okay, now you've got my attention. A fort with a story of rebellion. That's something I need to hear more about.
Fort Shirley was primarily built by the British, but like many Caribbean forts, it bears the architectural fingerprints of multiple European powers. The French, during their occupation of Dominica, also made significant additions to the fort's defenses. But what truly sets Fort Shirley apart is the 1802 revolt of the 8th West India Regiment.
Wait, a revolt. Tell me everything. Who were these rebels and what drove them to take such a drastic step?
The 8th West India Regiment was made up of African slave soldiers fighting for the British. Imagine the irony. Fighting for the very empire that enslaved them. They faced horrific conditions, constant abuse, and the terrifying prospect of being forced back into backbreaking labor on sugar plantations after their military service. Driven by desperation and a yearning for freedom, they staged an uprising, taking control of Fort Shirley for 3 days.
3 days. That must have taken incredible courage. Knowing the brutality of the British Empire, I can't imagine they went easy on these men.
You're right. While the rebellion was eventually quelled, the impact of this event reverberated throughout the British Empire. It exposed the hypocrisy of a system that relied on enslaved soldiers to maintain its power while denying them basic human rights.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of colonialism and the constant struggle for freedom that defined the Caribbean experience. What happened to the soldiers after the revolt was put down?
Well, while some faced harsh punishments, the revolt, along with growing abolitionist sentiment, contributed to a monumental change. Just 5 years later, in 1807, the British Empire abolished the slave trade. While this didn't end slavery outright, it was a significant step towards dismantling this inhumane system.
Wow, so this seemingly isolated act of rebellion in a remote Caribbean fort actually played a role in a much larger movement towards abolition. That's incredible. It really highlights how seemingly small acts of resistance can have ripple effects that change the course of history.
Exactly. And thankfully, Fort Shirley stands as a testament to that struggle for freedom. Dominican historian Dr. Lennox Church has been instrumental in restoring sections of the fort, ensuring that this pivotal site, with its powerful story, is preserved for future generations.
It's amazing how one person's dedication can make such a difference in preserving these historical treasures, and it's inspiring to see that even in places known for their beauty and tranquility like Dominica, there are stories of courage, resilience, and the fight for justice embedded in their history. Okay, I'm mentally adding Fort Shirley to my travel bucket list. But before we wrap up our Caribbean fort adventure, I'm curious about one more location you mentioned earlier, Panama.
Ah, yes, Panama. Often overlooked in the narrative of Caribbean history, played a crucial role in the region's colonial past. While not technically in the Caribbean Sea, Panama's Caribbean coast was a vital link in the network of trade routes that crisscrossed the region.
You're right. I tend to think of Panama in relation to the canal, but of course its strategic importance predates the modern canal by centuries. What kind of fortifications protected Panama's Caribbean coast during the colonial era?
We find a cluster of impressive fortifications at Portobello and the imposing San Lorenzo Castle. These structures, dating back to the 17th and 18th centuries, formed a defensive line protecting one of the most valuable trade routes in the world.
Okay, so Panama was basically the gateway between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a land bridge connecting two vast bodies of water. It makes sense that it would be heavily fortified, but why was Portobello so important? What made it such a target for pirates and rival European powers?
Portobello was a bustling port city, a hub for trade and commerce and home to the famous Portobello fairs. These fairs were massive events, drawing merchants from across the Spanish Empire and beyond. Imagine the riches flowing through this city. Gold, silver, spices, textiles. It was a treasure trove.
So basically, it was Fort Knox on the Caribbean coast, and those fortifications were there to protect the riches from anyone who dared to try their luck. What can you tell us about the architecture of these Panamanian forts? Do they reflect the styles we've seen in other parts of the Caribbean?
The Panamanian fortifications showcase a fascinating blend of architectural styles. You'll find elements of medieval influences, particularly in the older structures, and later additions incorporate neoclassical designs reflecting the evolution of military architecture over time.
It's amazing to think that these forts scattered across the Caribbean each tell a unique story, yet they're also interconnected. They're like pieces of a puzzle fitting together to create a larger picture of colonial history, conflict, and cultural exchange.
Exactly.
Oh,
And what's remarkable is that these forts, despite centuries of weathering storms, battles, and the passage of time, still stand. They're tangible reminders of the past, inviting us to explore their secrets, unravel their stories, and connect with the people who lived, fought, and shaped the Caribbean we know today.
this deep dive has been incredible. I feel like I've journeyed through time, witnessing the rise and fall of empires, the ingenuity of military engineers, and most importantly, the human stories. The struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices that played out within the walls of these Caribbean fortresses. Thank you for being such a fantastic guide.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, this is just the beginning of your exploration. Each of these forts has a wealth of stories waiting to be unearthed, and the Caribbean itself is an endless source of fascination and discovery.
Well said. To all our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring the fascinating world of Caribbean forts. Delve deeper into their history. Imagine the lives of those who walked their ramparts and let these incredible structures transport you back in time.